Hey guys, Darkantos here, and today we'll be covering the third part of the scenario tutorial, Trigger Editing. So whether it's to set up cinematics, creating certain events in gameplay, modifying the stats of a character, changing its name, invoking god powers by another player, even disabling the use of a unit that might cheese the winning conditions of your level. All of it requires triggers. They are the soul of your scenario and its core, the very engine of your craft. So first of all, what is a trigger? It is a tool within the scenario editor to create specific events or actions that happen under certain conditions, so it adds up to the complexity and interactivity of your map. Triggers consist of three main components. First, you got condition. This specifies when the trigger will activate. It can be anything from entering a specific area to a certain amount of time passed while you're actually in the gameplay of that scenario. Could be also death of a specific unit. Second, you got the effect. This is what happens when that condition is met. So, the effects can be diverse. Could be spawning units, changing the player's resources, altering the camera angle, even gaining god powers. Many effects can be linked to one condition, and the other way around. Many conditions have to be met in order to result only one effect. And finally, you got looping triggers. So triggers can either be triggering once or looped. If a trigger is looped, of course, the effect will keep happening every time that condition is met, but we'll see that later. So in my opinion, the best way to do this is to go over every condition and map in the game. And if it requires more depth and further explanation or examples, I'll cover that too. So first things first, the group editor allows you to create subcategories of triggers. Simply come here to triggers and then group editor. Then you may insert any group here and rename it. This feature helps you organize your triggers based on which part of the scenario they affect. Generally, I separate camera and cinematic triggers from the ones that are linked to gameplay. Additionally, you may separate upgrades and age-related triggers as well, since most of the time you want to have those taking effects at the start, and they barely have any solid conditions. The first condition we got on our list is Abort Cinematic. Oh boy, we're kicking it off with a complicated one. This is a condition that is fulfilled when an ongoing cinematic has just ended. Any effects on the other end will take action. This is mainly used to create skippable cinematics, which I never bothered doing and I'm guilty of it. Sometimes by the end of a cinematic, many events should have occurred. A unit was teleported somewhere, some god probably died, and some buildings probably destroyed, for the sake of your story of course. However, if you make a cinematic skippable, none of those events would have taken place. So scenario makers, including devs, use this condition to implement the same results that would have happened had the cinematic continued to the very end, but all at once. For instance, Darkantos should have walked all the way over here, and then right after some army was supposed to destroy a building and move on to a different area. Using Abort Cinematic as a condition, the effect would be to teleport Darkantos here, this building would just be destroyed directly without the army, and the army will just be teleported directly to that spot, and just instead of walking to it, because we won't be witnessing any of it. So, you'll have the same aftermath as if the cinematic was never skipped. And that's mainly what's used when cinematics are skippable. Next up we have all buildings dead, all units dead, or buildings and units both dead. This means when certain objects of a certain player are out of the equation. Well, actually not certain, all of them. So if you go with the all buildings dead condition and you assign a certain player for it, if all the buildings of that specific player are out of the equation and destroyed, the condition will be fulfilled and the effect will take place. Same for all units dead. If all units of the assigned player are dead, the effects will take place. And of course for units in buildings, it's the same thing for both types. Notice that if a unit is dead and it comes back to life, the condition won't be fulfilled. I'm saying this because it is kind of the case with heroes, since they come back to life if a unit is nearby. Next up is always, which literally translates into what it says. The effects will always be happening. There is no condition. This is mainly used in basic researches, upgrades, and ages. For instance, if you want your civilizations to start in game with heavy hoplites and heroic age, you put always as a condition. Like we saw in the previous video, we chose the wooden wall, because we knew we'll upgrade it eventually. So we'll use always as a condition for that, and we'll see which effects we are using when we finish conditions. Army distance to a unit or a point. This is fulfilled when one unit or an army that you chose and made as the source of this condition are at a certain distance to a certain unit, or just a point on the map that you set. The distance is in AOM yards. If you don't know what that is, use an AOM meter. This is approximately 5 yards in AOM, so if Darkantos here is within 5 yards, it will trigger the effect. Also note that using the operator, you may pick if you want the exact distance or less, or even the exact distance or above. You almost always want to pick the distance or less, because having it equal in the distance that you want specifically is just too brief, and sometimes it might not be happening, so of course you won't be using the distance that you want or above, because that defeats the whole purpose of having your unit at a certain point, and it will just trigger the effect as soon as the game starts. Next is Army in Line of Sight, or LOS. This condition is fulfilled when any unit selected or army assigned is within the line of sight of the source target unit. You can use this when the assigned army finds a certain treasure, say relic, or just finding another unit on the map. Once they get in the army's line of sight, they can have a dialogue, for example. Army is alive, which is a condition fulfilled when the source army is alive. Note that if only one unit among them is dead, this condition will not be fulfilled. Army is dead is actually the opposite. Every single unit selected needs to be dead to fulfill this condition. Though people tend to use the condition is dead or is alive directly instead of using the army one. It's just more flexible. The reason there are army conditions is because you can just pre-make armies and use them. I personally rarely ever do that, but it is always an option. Army owned is a condition that checks when the selected army is converted to the selected player. Army visible to player or visible to player are also vision related, but not to a specific unit's LOS. The source target needs to be in the square vision of your screen in order to check this condition. Otherwise, the player can choose to never set eyes on the source target, and even if they're in line of sight of all your units, it would still not trigger the effect, unless you set your eyes upon it. Chat contains is when the chat or messaging tool contains certain words that you enter in this condition. It doesn't matter what comes after or before, as long as in the entire text contains the one bit that you mentioned. For example, if the chat should contain trade wood to summon certain unit, you can even write an entire essay and still have the trade wood in the middle of it somewhere. Also, it's very important to mention that this condition is not cap sensitive.
Prostagma Ballista.
Difficulty level is how the game set up certain effects and events that would only happen if the player is playing on a specific difficulty, respectively in the following order: 0 being easy, 1 being moderate, 2 being hard, and finally 3 being Titan difficulty. For example, you want the enemy to invoke a Lightning Storm God Power on Titan difficulty, along with very short timers of army raids. You'll implement 2 triggers related to these 2 events, and you'll make sure that they only fire if level 3 difficulty is chosen by the player. We'll still get to the effects later, of course. Diplomacy changes when a player's status towards another is switched to the input of this condition. Say for instance if a player 1 becomes allies with player 2, send forces to their base. Also, the only way for diplomacy to change in the middle of the game is through the game options, or through a trigger effect. Gadget Visible can be ignored. It is a condition that was used by the developers and it serves no purpose in trigger editing. For us at least. Right after we have God Power active and God Power used. The latter means that in the player's logs, the God Power chosen has already been used this game, while God Power active is when the source is currently in use. This is more in use for GPs that have a lifetime, such as Restoration, Tornado, Meteors, etc. But it can be used for any God Power for that matter. Note that certain God Powers still use their old beta names in the editor. Same for objects. For example, lure is called Animal Magnetism. Percent damage checks when the entered value and percentage has been inflicted to the source unit as damage to their HP. Once again, you might want to use the operator to make the value equals or more. You know, just to avoid any instances of burst damage that can go beyond the desired value. Percent complete is when the source unit has reached or is currently on their maximum HP. This one is used mainly for building completion. Player active is used mostly in multiplayer. That means that the player hasn't lost yet and is actually currently active and playing the game. Player at pop cap, as its name defines. It checks when the assigned player has reached their population cap. Player resource count is when the selected player reaches a certain value of a specific resource. Once again, this can be regulated with the operator. Player unit count checks with the number of a unit or building type currently alive under a player. This is very helpful when you don't have to target a specific unit for the is dead condition. You can just set a specific count for that type of units. Also, since the is dead does not affect town setters, for the reason that settlements left behind are still considered part of the town setter, for whatever reason, so you can just use the player unit count instead, set town setter number to 0, and also, it is very important to know that town setters are named settlement level 1, the trigger editor. Yeah, take note of that. Quest var check and quest var compare are triggers that check certain values that are usually set by var set and var modify effects in the trigger editor. To be completely transparent, I never really understood how they work, nor did I ever felt the need to use them, and I don't think I'm missing out much. Stat value checks with the current value of one of the player's stats in the game. Most of these are the same stats you see at the end of a skirmish game, or multiplayer. As I make mostly solo scenarios, I think these could be useful in multiplayer mapmaking, and even then, it's too odd of a condition to be used. Tech researching triggers when a certain technology or research is currently progressing under a player. Could be an age, an armory upgrade, or anything similar, while tech available covers the same aspects, but it needs to be fully active and functional under the player. Timer straight up the time spent in seconds while this trigger was active. If you set it to 10 seconds, the effect will take place after that duration. Timer MS is the same but only in milliseconds, used more for time-sensitive events. Unit is Garrisoned In is when a certain unit goes in either all types or a specific type of unit or building that can contain. Could be transport ships, temples, sentries, TCs, etc. The only bummer about this condition is that if you want to set up a specific type of garrison, you don't have a list to pick from, you'll have to type the name down as it's named in the editor. Unit in area is one of the most used conditions, when any unit or specific unit type belonging to the assigned player reaches a certain area determined by another target unit and the radius around it. The event takes place. Notice that you may increase the radius around the target area or unit for more wiggle room. The count feature also allows you to add the factor of number of units that have to be there to trigger the effect. And with that, we conclude the conditions segment. Seeing how long this took to cover, unfortunately I'll be cutting the triggers tutorial in 2 segments. So in the next video we'll be going over the effect just like we did today with the conditions, and by the end of it we'll set up this map's triggers to make it playable. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next one.